The gates of Fota Correctional Facility groaned open with a sound that echoed like a warning. It was the kind of place where hope didn't survive long. The walls were thick, stained with rust and time, and every corridor smelled of disinfectant and steel. Inside, the air was heavy with despair, broken men pacing in cages, guards barking orders, and the clatter of chains dragging across the concrete floor. Among the sea of inmates, James Carter stood out. At 36, he wasn't the largest or the loudest prisoner, but there was something unsettling about the way his eyes stayed fixed, as if he were staring at a ghost that no one else could see. His body was lean from years behind bars, his face etched with the lines of a man who had lived too many lifetimes in too short a span. The other inmates knew him as quiet, watchful, and unpredictable. But James had something most men inside Filorida didn't have: a wife. Melissa. Her name alone was enough to silence the mockery of other prisoners. She was the one thing he clung to, the single thread that kept him from unraveling completely. James carried her letters folded neatly in the pocket of his prison blues. The edges had grown soft from being unfolded, read, and smoothed out over and over again. Late at night, when the noise of the cell block died down, he would sit on the edge of his bunk and trace his fingers across her handwriting, whispering her words under his breath as if they were scripture. "Dear James," one of her letters read, "no matter how dark your world is, know that I'm waiting for you on the outside. You are not forgotten. You are loved." For a man like James, raised in poverty, hardened by violence, and abandoned by nearly everyone he had ever trusted, those words were oxygen. They gave him something the prison couldn't take: a reason to wake up each morning. The other inmates noticed. "Man, you're the luckiest bastard in here," one prisoner sneered one afternoon in the yard, his voice dripping with envy. "A wife who writes you every week. The rest of us got nobody. Just steel and concrete." James didn't look up. He folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket like a treasure. "She's the reason I'm still breathing," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The guards had their own opinions. Some mocked him, some envied him, but all of them knew James was different because of her. Even the hardest inmate carried a spark of humanity when love was involved, and Melissa was that spark for James. Her visits were like sunlight breaking into the darkest corners of Filorida. Dressed in soft colors, her smile tender but weary, Melissa would sit across from him in the visiting room, separated only by a battered steel table. They would talk for hours about life beyond these walls, about dreams of a house near the ocean, about second chances. James would lean in close, lowering his voice as if to shield their words from the guards. "You're all I got, Mel," he told her once, gripping her hand across the table. His voice cracked despite his effort to sound steady. "Don't you ever lie to me. Don't you ever leave me." She smiled faintly, squeezing his fingers. "I'm not going anywhere, James. I promise." Promises. In Filorida, promises were rare and fragile things, but James believed hers. He had to, because in a world built on betrayal and survival, Melissa was the only anchor keeping him from drifting into madness. Yet even as she smiled, there were shadows in her eyes, shadows James never questioned, shadows that hinted at secrets buried deep beneath her gentle words. For now, though, James chose not to see them. For now, Melissa was his salvation. What no one in Filorida knew, not the guards, not the inmates, not even James himself, was that the secret Melissa carried would one day turn that salvation into the spark of the darkest violence the prison had ever witnessed. Melissa Carter was the kind of woman who left an impression. To the guards in Filorida's visiting hall, she was known for her quiet grace. To James, she was everything: his light, his lifeline. Each time she walked through the prison gates, dressed in modest skirts and soft sweaters, heads turned. She didn't belong in a place like this, yet she kept coming back. Their love story had started in the most unlikely way, through a prison pen pal program. Melissa had written him first. At first, James thought it was a joke. Why would anyone reach out to a man like him? A man serving hard time with little hope of ever rebuilding a normal life. But as the letters kept arriving, filled with warmth and understanding, his skepticism gave way to something deeper. He answered her, pouring out pieces of his soul he had never shared with anyone. On paper, they built a bond that felt stronger than the steel bars between them. In every line, Melissa promised a future that seemed almost impossible: freedom, a home, a chance to be human again. When James closed his eyes at night, it was her voice he imagined, her laughter echoing in a world far beyond the razor wire. But Melissa carried a weight James could not see. Behind her gentle eyes lay a history she had spent years burying. She was not just a woman who fell in love with an inmate. She was someone who had lived another life, under another name: Michael. She had crossed oceans of fear and shame to reinvent herself, to live the life she always believed she was meant for. To James, she was simply Melissa, the woman who loved him. But in her chest, a secret beat like a second heart, one she prayed would never be exposed inside this place where weakness was blood in the water. During their visits, she spoke often of dreams. "I want us to start fresh," Melissa whispered one afternoon, her voice low so the guards wouldn't overhear. "When you're out, James, we'll leave all of this behind. Just you and me. We'll find a little house, maybe by the coast, somewhere no one knows our names." James's rough hands gripped hers, holding on like a drowning man clutching driftwood. "You're all I got, Mel. I don't care where we go, so long as it's with you. But promise me, don't ever hide from me. Don't ever keep anything from me." Melissa forced a smile, her heart pounding. She wanted to tell him everything, to confess the truth before it was ripped from her in some cruel way. But fear silenced her. She had seen the way James's eyes flared when he felt betrayed. She knew how fragile his trust was, how quick his love could burn into rage. "I promise," she whispered, her voice breaking just enough for James to notice. He searched her face for answers, but he wanted to believe too badly. He let the unease pass. In that visiting room, surrounded by steel and surveillance, two people clung to a fragile dream. But like a candle burning in the wind, Melissa's secret flickered dangerously. One wrong move, one wrong word, and everything she had built with James could go up in flames. And deep down, Melissa knew, the day that truth came out, there would be no second chances. At first, James brushed off the unease. Melissa had been nothing but faithful, visiting every week, writing every few days, whispering promises that carried him through the darkest nights. But small things started to gnaw at him, things he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. It was in the way she dodged questions about her past. Every time he asked about her childhood, her family, or where she grew up, Melissa's smile would tighten and she'd change the subject. She would talk about the future with ease but treated the past like a locked door that must never be opened. One evening in the yard, James overheard two inmates whispering. They were leaning against the chain-link fence, smoking contraband cigarettes. "You know Carter's wife?" one muttered, a crooked grin spreading across his face. "Word is she ain't what she seems. Used to go by another name." The other laughed under his breath. "Figures. He's in love with a ghost." The words hit James like a blade sliding between his ribs. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. For the rest of the night, the whispers played on a loop in his mind. Back in his cell, James pulled out Melissa's letters. He laid them across his bunk, dozens of pages written in her careful handwriting. He read them again, searching for cracks, for slips, for something, anything, that might reveal the truth. The words were warm, affectionate, full of longing. But the more he read, the more he noticed what wasn't there. No stories of family holidays. No childhood memories. No photographs enclosed like other prison wives sometimes sent. It was as though Melissa had appeared out of thin air. James's cellmate, an older convict named Harlan, watched him obsess over the letters night after night. "You're looking at those words like they're going to give you all the answers," Harlan said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. "But sometimes, no answer is the answer." James glared at him. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Harlan shrugged. "Means if she's hiding something, it'll come out sooner or later. Secrets don't stay buried in a place like this. Not with all these eyes watching." The unease became paranoia. Every glance from a guard, every snicker from another inmate felt like confirmation that they knew something he didn't. James began to question Melissa during visits, subtle at first, then sharper. "Why won't you tell me about your family?" he pressed one afternoon, his eyes narrowing. Melissa shifted in her seat, forcing a smile. "James, you know my family isn't part of my life anymore. You're my family now." Her words should have comforted him. Instead, they deepened the pit in his stomach. That night, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his cell, his mind a storm. Doubt was poison, and it was spreading fast. He remembered her promise, "Don't ever lie to me." He clung to it, yet every instinct screamed that something wasn't right. For the first time since meeting Melissa, James felt fear, not of losing her to the outside world, but of what might happen if the whispers proved true. And in Filorida, fear always found its way to violence. Saturday afternoons at Fota Correctional Facility carried a strange kind of anticipation. The visiting room always buzzed with nervous energy, prisoners dressed in their cleanest blues, families lining up with paperwork in hand, guards shouting orders to keep the chaos contained. James Carter's name was called, and he rose from the metal bench. His heart pounded in his chest as he was escorted down the corridor. Every step echoed like a drumbeat of dread. He had spent sleepless nights replaying whispers, dissecting Melissa's evasive answers, watching her every gesture with growing suspicion. Today, he wanted answers. Today, he wasn't going to let her dodge him. The door to the visiting hall opened with a heavy groan. The room was sterile, fluorescent lights buzzing above, cameras perched in every corner, guards leaning against the walls with folded arms. Prisoners sat across from their loved ones at battered steel tables, voices low but tense, laughter forced and fleeting. And there she was. Melissa sat waiting, her hands folded on the table, her soft blouse making her look painfully out of place in the gray room. Her face lit up when she saw him, but James's eyes were hard, suspicious. He sat down slowly, leaning forward, his stare never leaving hers. "You look tired," Melissa said softly, her voice meant to soothe. James ignored the comment. His voice was sharp, almost a growl. "Who are you, really?" Melissa froze. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic. "James, what are you talking about?" "Don't play with me," he snapped, slamming his fist against the table. The sound echoed through the room, drawing glances from nearby prisoners and a warning look from a guard. James lowered his voice, but his fury boiled over every word. "I heard things. I heard your name wasn't always Melissa." Melissa's fingers trembled where they rested on the table. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then tried to steady her breath. "James, please. Tell me the truth." His voice cracked, a raw mixture of desperation and rage. Tears welled in Melissa's eyes. She leaned closer, her voice breaking. "Before I was Melissa, I was Michael. That's the truth. But that was another life, James. A life I left behind because it wasn't who I really was. You're the only man I've ever truly loved. I chose you." The words hit James like a gunshot. His body stiffened, his hands shaking on the cold steel table. His breath grew ragged, his chest heaving as if the air itself was choking him. You lied to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then louder, "You made me believe. You made me a fool in front of everyone in this hellhole." Melissa reached for his hand, her tears spilling freely. "I never lied about loving you. Everything I said, every word, was real. Please, James, don't let this destroy us." James jerked his hand away as though her touch burned him. His face twisted, rage and heartbreak colliding in his expression. In the corner, a guard shifted uneasily but didn't intervene yet. Prison arguments were common, and they rarely turned violent in this tightly monitored space. But this was different. James stood abruptly, the legs of his chair screeching against the floor. "You promised me," he roared. His voice filled the hall, silencing the hum of conversations around them. "You promised you'd never lie to me." Melissa's sobs grew desperate. "I was afraid, James. Afraid you'd leave me, afraid you'd hate me. But I loved you too much to let you go." Every prisoner, every family member, every guard could feel the storm brewing at that table. James's eyes burned with betrayal, his body trembling with violent energy he could no longer contain. For years, Melissa had been his salvation. In a world built on lies and violence, she had been his truth. But now that truth had shattered, and all that remained was a man undone. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in. Melissa's confession lingered in the air like poison, and James Carter, once held together by fragile hope, was about to explode. And in Fota prison, when hope collapsed, violence always followed. The room went dead silent. Conversations that had been buzzing just moments earlier froze mid-sentence. Even the guards, used to the occasional flare-ups between inmates and their visitors, sensed that something was different here. James Carter's face was a mask of rage and heartbreak, his body trembling like a man on the edge of collapse. His chest rose and fell in violent bursts, his eyes locked on Melissa with a fury that seemed to ignite the very air around them. "You tricked me," he whispered at first, his voice hoarse, almost childlike. Then louder, his words cracked through the room. "You tricked me, and you laughed while I believed every damn word." Melissa shook her head, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. "No, James, I never laughed at you. I loved you. Everything we shared was real. Please, you have to believe that." Her plea only fueled the fire. James slammed both fists onto the steel table, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. The table rattled, the fluorescent lights above flickering with the sudden impact. Nearby prisoners craned their necks to see, their families clutching their children, fear spreading through the hall like smoke. A guard took a step forward, hand resting on his baton. "Carter, sit down," he barked. But James didn't hear him. He was drowning in the tidal wave of betrayal. His whole life had been defined by abandonment, by lies, by people turning their backs when he needed them most. Melissa had been his one escape, his one light, and now she was just another cruel joke in a world that had never given him a chance. In one violent motion, James lunged across the table. His hands clamped around Melissa's throat with a ferocity that shocked even himself. Her eyes widened in terror, her voice cut off into a choked gasp. "James, please," she tried to scream, but it came out as a strangled whimper. Her nails clawed at his arms, desperate, tearing at his skin. "You lied to me," James roared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You made me believe I had someone. You made me a fool." Melissa kicked against the table, knocking her chair back. The legs screeched against the floor as she struggled, her face turning red, then purple. Tears streamed down her cheeks as her eyes pleaded with him for mercy. Guards rushed forward, shouting, "Get him off her!" Now, the sound of boots pounded against the concrete, but James was locked in his frenzy, deaf to everything except the storm inside his skull. Other inmates shouted from their tables. Some cursed, others egged him on, their voices rising into chaos. Families screamed, children cried, the visiting room transforming into a theater of horror. Melissa managed to choke out a single word, her voice ragged and broken. "Love." For a split second, James's grip faltered, his eyes flickering with something. Doubt, grief, recognition. But then the fury returned, stronger, blinding. He tightened his hands around her neck with renewed force, shutting out everything but his own pain. Melissa's body convulsed, her feet kicking weakly against the floor. Her hands, once frantic, began to lose strength. Her fingers slipped from his arms, falling limply to her sides. "Carter, let her go," a guard shouted, swinging his baton. It connected with James's shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through his body. Still, he didn't release her. He roared like a wounded animal, refusing to let go, refusing to surrender the rage that had consumed him. It took 3 guards to drag him off her. They pried his fingers loose one by one, his nails still digging into her skin. James fought like a man possessed, spitting and screaming as they wrestled him to the ground. "She lied. She lied," he howled, his voice breaking into sobs even as they cuffed his wrists behind his back. Melissa collapsed onto the cold floor, her body still, her chest unmoving. A guard knelt beside her, calling frantically for medical staff. But the silence in the room told everyone the truth before the paramedics even arrived. The visiting room, once filled with murmured conversations and fleeting laughter, was now drenched in shock. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, prisoners sat frozen in disbelief, and the guards dragged James away as he thrashed against their grip. James's face was streaked with tears, his mouth twisted into a scream that tore through the hall. "She loved me? Then why did she lie?" His cries faded as the door slammed shut behind him, leaving behind a room full of witnesses who would never forget what they had seen. And at the center of the chaos lay Melissa, silent, broken, and gone. The visiting hall was a graveyard of silence after the storm. The echo of Melissa's final gasp still lingered in the air, as if the walls themselves had absorbed her last breath. Families clutched each other in shock, children sobbed into their mothers' arms, and hardened inmates sat wide-eyed, stunned by what they had just witnessed. James Carter was dragged down the corridor, shackled, his voice hoarse from screaming. His eyes were wild, his face streaked with tears and sweat. She lied, he kept repeating, his words tumbling out in a broken loop. She lied to me. She lied. His voice faded as the heavy door slammed shut behind him, leaving only the hollow thud of his absence. On the floor of the visiting hall, Melissa's body lay still. A paramedic team rushed in, their hands working quickly, but the outcome was already written. Her neck bore the red, raw imprint of James's hands, and her chest did not rise again. After only a few desperate attempts, one medic shook his head. A white sheet was pulled over her face. The guards exchanged looks, some hardened, some shaken, but all knew this scene would haunt the prison for years. For them, violence was nothing new. But this was different. This was a murder born not of prison politics, not of gangs or debts, but of love twisted into betrayal. Whispers spread like wildfire among the inmates as they were herded back to their blocks. Carter killed her, his own wife. Man, the only person who ever came for him, and he strangled her dead. He snapped. Just like that. Snapped. In the mess hall that night, no one laughed. No one bragged. Even the loudest voices were muted, drowned by the memory of James's roar and Melissa's desperate struggle. In the solitary wing, James sat on the floor of his isolation cell, his wrists bruised from the cuffs, his mind unraveling in the suffocating quiet. He rocked back and forth, muttering the same words under his breath. She promised me. She promised. The rage that had consumed him was gone, leaving only an empty shell, a man gutted by the very truth he thought he wanted. Inside Filorida, violence was routine. But that day, everyone understood they had witnessed something different. A love story turned to ashes, and a man who destroyed the only light he ever had. The murder inside Filorida made headlines across Florida. The public was fascinated and horrified. An inmate who killed his own wife in the middle of a prison visiting room, surrounded by guards, families, and children. Newspapers called it the betrayal killing. Talk radio hosts argued over who was to blame, Melissa for keeping her past hidden, or James for letting rage become murder. Months later, James Carter stood in court, shackled at the wrists, wearing a plain suit borrowed from the public defender's office. Gone was the quiet inmate who once clung to letters as lifelines. In his place was a man hollowed out by grief, guilt, and unrepentant fury. The courtroom buzzed with spectators. Reporters filled the benches, their pens ready to capture every word. At the front sat Melissa's few remaining relatives, faces stiff with sorrow, some unable to meet James's eyes. The air felt heavy, as though the weight of what had happened inside those prison walls pressed down on everyone in attendance. The prosecution wasted no time. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecutor began, pacing before the jury. This case is not complicated. James Carter strangled his wife to death in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, on camera. There is no question about whether he did it. The only question is whether you believe his excuses. He turned sharply, pointing toward James. The defendant wants you to believe he was a victim of betrayal, that he snapped. But betrayal does not justify murder. Lies do not excuse violence. He knew what he was doing. He chose to kill her. The jury sat in silence, their faces grim. When it was the defense's turn, James's attorney, a weary man named Richard Hall, rose slowly. His voice was softer, almost pleading. James Carter is guilty of many things, Hall said. But he is also a man who has lived his entire life in abandonment and pain. When he discovered the truth about Melissa, truth she had hidden because she feared losing him, he broke. He acted in shock, in despair, not with cold calculation. We ask you to see him as a man shattered, not a monster. All eyes turned to James when he was called to testify. His hands shook as he gripped the stand, his voice cracked but determined. I loved her, he said, his gaze darting between the jury and the floor. She was all I had. Every word she wrote, every visit, it was my reason to live. And then she told me she wasn't who I thought she was. My whole world collapsed. You don't understand what that feels like, to have the only truth you hold ripped away. His voice rose, his anger boiling through his grief. I didn't plan it. I didn't wake up wanting to kill her. I just wanted the truth. And when I got it, it destroyed me. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Others stared coldly. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. Mr. Carter, she said firmly, Truth may wound, but murder cannot be undone. The court cannot excuse what you did. After days of testimony, witness accounts, and endless replay of the grainy prison footage, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. James stood motionless as the words were read. His jaw tightened, but his eyes glistened. The gavel struck, sealing his fate. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the judge declared. May the weight of what you have done follow you as long as you live. The courtroom erupted, reporters scribbling, Melissa's relatives weeping, and James being led away in shackles once again. As he disappeared through the side door, his voice echoed one last time, not in rage, but in something closer to despair. She promised me. She promised. When the verdict was read and the sentence delivered, the story of James and Melissa Carter reached its end in the eyes of the law. But for those who had witnessed the events, the guards, the inmates, the families in that visiting hall, the echoes of that day would never truly fade. Melissa was laid to rest in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of town. Her funeral was small, attended by a few distant relatives and a handful of people from the prison ministry who had known her through her visits. There were no long eulogies, no crowded pews, just a simple service for a woman whose life ended too suddenly, too violently. The priest's words hung in the air. We bury not just a body, but broken dreams, and we ask for mercy upon a soul who sought love, even when love betrayed her. Meanwhile, James was returned to Filorida, this time not as a man clinging to fragile hope, but as a lifer with nothing left. He was placed in the solitary wing, where the walls pressed closer and the silence screamed louder than any cell block noise ever had. In the nights that followed, guards would sometimes hear him muttering in the dark, the same words over and over. She promised me. She promised. For the inmates who had seen it all unfold, the story became legend, retold in hushed voices in the yard. Some painted James as a fool, destroying the only person who ever loved him. Others whispered with a strange kind of pity, saying no man could have survived a betrayal like that without breaking. But beneath the gossip, all knew one thing. Fota had witnessed something different that day. Not just violence, but love turned inside out, twisted until it destroyed everything in its path. The world outside moved on, as it always does. The headlines faded, replaced by newer scandals and fresher tragedies. But inside those prison walls, the memory lingered. The visiting room never felt the same. For months afterward, families entered it more cautiously, glancing at the steel tables as though expecting ghosts to sit there. What remained was a lesson carved into the hearts of those who lived it. Secrets can kill. The truth, however brutal, is less deadly than a lie left to rot in the dark. Melissa had hidden hers out of fear, believing love could survive without it. James had demanded truth but was unprepared for the weight it carried. Together, their choices built a fragile house of cards, and when it fell, it crushed them both. In the end, James Carter was left with nothing but silence, his life stretching into decades of confinement, his story remembered not as a tale of redemption, but as a warning. Melissa's grave, unmarked by flowers or visits, bore witness to the cost of a secret too heavy to bear. And somewhere deep in the stillness of Filota's solitary wing, a broken man whispered into the dark, as if the concrete itself could hear him. All I wanted was love.